November 7th, 1943. 14,000 feet above the churning blue waters of Rabaul Harbor, the air was thin, cold, and charged with the tension of impending combat. First-class aviation machinist mate Richard Parker hunkered down in the cramped rear gunner's compartment of his F-4U Corsair, his gloved fingers tightening around the twin .50 caliber machine gun grips until his knuckles whitened. The metal of the gun mounts hummed softly beneath his palms, a low vibration that blended with the throaty roar of the Corsair's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. His eyes, sharpened by 8 months of aerial combat, locked onto a glint of silver in the sky. A Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0, diving toward him from the 11 o'clock high position, its wings tilted in a deadly bank that Parker recognized all too well. It was the same angle that had claimed the lives of 3 of his fellow rear gunners in the past 6 weeks, a grim pattern that had cast a shadow over every mission his squadron flew. At 24 years old, Parker was no rookie, but his combat record was a stark, discouraging contrast to the hours of training he'd endured. 8 months in the rear gunner's seat, 17 harrowing combat engagements, and not a single confirmed kill to his name. The numbers gnawed at him, a constant reminder that the tactics he'd been taught were failing him, and failing the men around him. Below, the sprawling Japanese airbase at Rabaul stretched out, its runways crisscrossing the jungle like scars, while American bombers droned in formation, their payloads ready to rain destruction on the harbor and airfields. But Parker's focus was solely on the Zero closing in, its engine screaming as it accelerated toward the Corsair at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour. That morning, 32 Zeros had launched from Rabaul's airfields, their mission to intercept the American bomber formation, a force that outnumbered the escorting fighters and threatened to overwhelm the thin line of defense Parker's squadron provided. As he tracked the incoming Zero, Parker's mind flashed back to the stories of the men he'd replaced, each killed by the same fatal flaw in the Navy's gunnery doctrine. The first was second-class aviation machinist mate David Martinez, killed on September 14, 1943. Martinez had been a by-the-book gunner, a man who'd memorized every page of the Pensacola training manual and followed its instructions without hesitation. When a Zero attacked from the 9 o'clock level that day, Martinez had aimed directly at the target, leading it by half a wingspan, exactly as he'd been taught in gunnery school. His tracers streaked through the air, bright red against the blue, but they always lagged behind the nimble Zero, missing by inches that might as well have been miles. The enemy pilot, sensing Martinez's ineffectiveness, pressed the attack, his 20mm cannons firing in short, devastating bursts. The rounds tore through the Corsair's fuel tank, igniting a fireball that consumed the aircraft in seconds. Martinez died before his pilot could even radio for help. His body never recovered from the wreckage that plummeted into the ocean. Next came third-class aviation machinist mate Tommy Wilson, lost on October 3rd. Wilson, frustrated by the manual's failures, had dared to deviate from the doctrine, doubling his lead to 2 full wingspans instead of the prescribed half. It was a desperate gamble, born of watching tracers miss and Zeros escape. But it had made no difference. His rounds arced harmlessly into the empty sky, while the Zeros danced around his fire, their pilots laughing off his ineffective attacks. When a Zero made a head-on pass, Wilson fired in a panic, his fingers squeezing the trigger so hard his hands ached. But the Japanese pilot knew Wilson couldn't hit him. He closed to within 200 yards, a distance that left no room for error, and unleashed a volley that shredded the Corsair's engine. Wilson's plane went down in a plume of black smoke, spiraling toward the jungle below. Search parties never found his body. He was listed as missing in action, another casualty of a tactics system that was broken. Then there was second-class aviation machinist mate James Coe, killed on October 27th. Coe's story was identical to the others: perfect form, textbook technique, and 0 kills. He'd aimed where the manual told him to aim, led the target by the calculated distance, and watched his tracers miss every time. A Zero that he couldn't hit had closed in, its cannons punching through the Corsair's fuselage and killing him instantly. By early November, the squadron had lost 8 rear gunners in 6 weeks, a staggering toll that had left the remaining men on edge. their confidence shattered by the knowledge that the training they'd relied on was a death sentence. Every gunner in the squadron knew the Pensacola deflection shooting method wasn't working. They'd seen it fail, seen their friends die because of it, but there was no alternative. The Navy had spent years developing the system, backing it with mathematics, laboratory tests, and the authority of experts that had never faced a live Zero pilot in combat. To deviate from the manual was to risk disciplinary action, or worse, to be labeled incompetent if things went wrong. So they kept following the rules, even as the body count rose. Now, as the Zero bore down on him, 300 yards out and closing fast, Parker heard the voice of his gunnery instructor in his head, reciting the doctrine word for word. Aim directly at the target, lead it slightly, squeeze the trigger when it fills the sight picture. It was the same instruction that had gotten Martinez, Wilson, and Co. killed. For a split second, Parker hesitated, instinct warring with training. But in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He ignored every lesson he'd ever learned. Instead of aiming at the Zero, or even slightly ahead of it, Parker locked his sights 8 full aircraft lengths into the empty sky. Nothing but thin air between his guns and the point where he was certain the Zero would be in 10 seconds. It felt wrong, counterintuitive, like he was throwing his bullets away. But he'd watched enough tracers miss, enough Zeros escape, to know that the old way wasn't working. This was a gamble, but it was the only one he had. Lieutenant James Morrison, Parker's pilot, sensed the danger and hauled the Corsair into a sharp left bank. The G-forces slamming Parker back into his seat so hard he could barely breathe. His arms felt like they weighed 40 pounds each, his muscles straining to hold the heavy machine gun steady. The gun sight vibrated violently against his eye, blurring his vision for a split second, but he forced himself to focus on the empty point in the sky where he'd aimed. The Zero streaked across his field of vision, moving so fast that by the time he'd completed the manual's required calculations, the target would have already changed position. Parker squeezed both triggers. The twin .50 caliber guns roared to life, their sound deafening even through his leather helmet and earplugs. Hot brass casings ejected from the guns, clinking against the metal floor of the compartment and bouncing past his face. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air, thick and choking, while the recoil jolted his shoulders backward with each burst. Tracers arced out ahead of the Corsair, a bright red stream that looked like it would miss by a mile. So far ahead of the Zero that any onlooker would have thought Parker was firing blindly. But then, the impossible happened. The Zero flew straight into Parker's bullet stream, not where he'd aimed initially, but where the bullets would be 3 seconds later, exactly as the enemy fighter reached that point in space. There was a loud metallic shriek as the rounds tore through the Zero's engine cowling, shattering its propeller into pieces. Black smoke billowed from the wreckage, and the Zero rolled inverted, its wings flapping uselessly before it began a steep spiral toward the ocean 4 miles below. Parker watched it fall, his mouth dry, his hands still gripping the gun grips. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp with disbelief and shock. "What the hell kind of shooting was that, Parker?" Parker didn't answer right away. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that he'd just defied every hour of gunnery training he'd ever received. He'd aimed at a future point in space, not a present target, and it had worked. For the first time in 17 engagements, he'd hit a Zero. He'd survived an attack that would have killed any other gunner following the manual. The Corsair leveled out, continuing its patrol over Rabaul. Below, the American bombers were dropping their payloads, the explosions sending plumes of smoke into the sky. But Parker's mind was elsewhere, replaying the shot over and over again. He knew more Zeros would be coming. This was just the first wave of the Japanese counterattack. And when they did, he'd face a choice. Go back to the safety of the manual, the tactics that had failed so many, or trust the unorthodox method he'd just stumbled into. If you're finding this story of courage and defiance compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us share more untold histories like this one, stories of ordinary men who did extraordinary things in the darkest days of war. Now let's continue with Parker's mission as he prepares to face the next wave of Japanese fighters and decide whether to trust his training or his instincts. 3 minutes after Parker's first confirmed kill, The tension in the Corsair's cockpit spiked again. Morrison's voice came over the intercom, sharp and urgent. "Two more zeros, 10 o'clock level, closing fast." Parker rotated his gun turret, the metal gears grinding as he swiveled to face the new threat. The two Japanese fighters were flying in tight formation, their wings almost touching, their engines screaming as they closed in on the American formation. This time, there was no hesitation in Parker's mind. He knew what he had to do. The Navy's standard procedure for this scenario was clear. Estimate the target speed, calculate the crossing angle, and lead the target by half a wingspan for every 100 knots of speed. It was a simple formula, one that every gunner memorized in training, but it was built on a fatal assumption, that the target would fly in a straight, predictable path. In reality, Japanese Zero pilots were trained to be anything but predictable. They dove, turned, climbed, and changed direction constantly, making the manual's calculations obsolete the moment combat began. Parker ignored the formula. Instead, he made a calculation that no training manual had ever taught him, one born of 8 months of watching tracers miss and Zeros escape. He estimated the Zeros' combined closing speed at roughly 200 knots, and he knew that a .50 caliber round took about 1 second to travel the 300-yard engagement range. In that 1 second, a Zero traveling at 300 miles per hour would cover nearly 440 feet, 10 full aircraft lengths. So Parker aimed 10 aircraft lengths ahead of the lead Zero, locking his sights onto a point in the sky where nothing existed but thin air and his unshakable certainty that this was the only way to hit. He squeezed the triggers again, the twin .50 calibers roaring to life. Tracers streaked out ahead of the Corsair, a bright red stream that seemed to vanish into the empty sky. For a split second, Parker feared he'd missed, that his gamble had failed. But then the lead Zero flew straight into the bullet stream, exactly where Parker had predicted it would be. Its canopy shattered into a million pieces, and the pilot slumped forward, the aircraft nose-diving toward the ocean. The second Zero, seeing its wingman go down, broke hard to the right, vanishing into a bank of clouds before Parker could line up a second shot. Morrison's voice came over the intercom again, this time with no hint of disbelief, only awe. "You're not aiming at them, are you?" "No, sir," Parker replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm aiming at where they're going to be." "That's not what they taught us at Pensacola," Morrison said, a note of confusion in his tone. "I know, sir," Parker said, "but the other way wasn't working." There was a long silence over the intercom, 5 seconds that felt like an eternity to Parker. He knew he was risking his career, maybe even his life, by defying Navy doctrine. But Morrison had seen the results. He'd watched 2 Zeros go down in minutes, something no other gunner in the squadron had done in months. Finally, Morrison spoke, his words a lifeline for Parker. "Keep doing it." The patrol dragged on for another 40 minutes, each second filled with the constant threat of attack. Rabaul's air defenses were relentless. Anti-aircraft fire burst around the formation, black puffs of smoke that could shred an aircraft in an instant, while more Zeros lurked in the clouds, waiting for a chance to strike. Parker got 3 more firing opportunities in those 40 minutes, and each time, he used his new method, aiming impossibly far ahead of the targets. 2 more Zeros went down, their wreckage spiraling into the ocean, while a third broke off the attack, trailing smoke from a damaged engine. When Morrison finally brought the Corsair back to the carrier, the tail was riddled with bullet holes, a testament to how close they'd come to being shot down. But they'd survived, and Parker had just rewritten the rules of aerial deflection shooting without even realizing he was doing it. What Parker didn't know yet was why his method worked when the Navy's official doctrine had failed so catastrophically. The problem of deflection shooting wasn't new to 1943. It had been plaguing American air crews since the attack on Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of men and costing the Navy hundreds of aircraft. The 1942 Navy Gunnery Manual dedicated 12 pages to deflection shooting theory, filled with complex diagrams of lead angles, tables calculating sight pictures based on target speed and crossing angle, and mathematical formulas that worked perfectly in a laboratory but collapsed spectacularly in the chaos of combat. The core issue was speed, specifically the Zero's unmatched maneuverability. The Japanese fighter was a marvel of engineering for its time. It could reach a top speed of 330 miles per hour, turn tighter than almost any American aircraft in the Pacific Theater, and reverse direction in under 4 seconds. When a Zero pilot wanted to evade enemy fire, he didn't fly straight. He pulled hard turns, climbed at steep angles, dove toward the ocean, and changed direction so rapidly that even the most skilled gunner couldn't keep up with the manual's required calculations. The doctrine had been developed before the war, designed for static targets and predictable flight paths, and it had never been updated to account for the Zero's agility. American gunners were trained on a system that was obsolete before they ever saw combat. They practiced on towed targets, fabric sleeves pulled by aircraft flying straight and level at predictable speeds, and were told that enemy pilots would behave rationally, flying in straight lines long enough for them to calculate the required lead. But Japanese pilots didn't behave rationally. They were aggressive, fearless, and willing to press attacks so close that American gunners had no time to think, let alone calculate. This mismatch between training and reality was a death sentence. Between December 1941 and October 1943, U.S. forces in the Pacific lost over 800 aircraft to Japanese fighters, and many of those losses were directly attributable to gunners' inability to hit maneuvering targets. The statistics were grim. American rear gunners scored confirmed kills on just 6% of their firing opportunities. That meant 94% of the time, their ammunition was wasted, the Zero escaped, and their aircraft remained vulnerable to attack. Squadron commanders knew the numbers, knew the doctrine was failing, but they had no alternative. The Navy had invested years of time and money into the deflection shooting system, and it was backed by the authority of experts at Pensacola who had never been shot at by a Zero pilot. Ammunition was another problem, one that compounded the failures of the doctrine. The Corsair's rear gun position carried 1,500 rounds total for both 50 caliber. Sounds like a lot until you do the math. At a combined rate of 500 rounds per minute, that's just 3 minutes of continuous fire. But gunners never fired continuously. They used short, 2-second bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent the gun barrels from overheating. Each burst used roughly 16 rounds, which meant a rear gunner had only about 90 bursts available for an entire mission. Hardly enough when each engagement required split-second decisions, and a missed burst meant the target was gone or the gunner was out of position. The Japanese knew exactly how to exploit these flaws. Zero pilots were trained in a tactic that American gunners called the Zero Dance, a series of unpredictable turns, dives, and climbs designed to make deflection shooting useless. When an American gunner opened fire, the Zero pilot would brake hard in any direction, knowing that the gunner had aimed at his current position. By the time the bullets arrived, the pilot would be hundreds of feet away. Then he'd reverse direction and attack from a new angle, catching the gunner off guard. It was a deadly game, one that the Japanese almost always won. Parker had lived this frustration firsthand. In his 17 previous combat engagements, he'd followed the manual to the letter, aiming at targets and adding the prescribed lead, only to watch his tracers miss every time. He'd watched the Zero Dance, watched his friends die, and felt the weight of failure gnaw at him. On his 4th combat mission in July 1943, a Zero had attacked from the stern, and Parker had fired 3 textbook deflection bursts, all misses. The Zero's cannons had torn through the Corsair's left wing and fuel tank, and Morrison had barely nursed the plane back to the carrier on one engine, in fumes. After they landed, Morrison hadn't said a word, but Parker knew he'd failed. That failure had haunted him for 4 months, driving him to question everything he'd been taught. The Navy's response to the crisis was to double down on the flawed system. More training, more range time, more emphasis on mental calculations. But none of it addressed the core issue. The doctrine was built on wrong assumptions about how combat actually worked. Some gunners, driven by desperation, had tried to modify the technique on their own, leading targets by larger amounts or firing in wild, uncontrolled bursts. But these experiments had failed too. The problem wasn't the amount of lead. It was that any calculation based on the target's current position was obsolete by the time the bullets arrived. By November 7, 1943, Parker had had enough. He was tired of following rules that got men killed, tired of watching Zeros escape, tired of feeling powerless. When that zero dove at him over Rabaul Harbor, he'd made a choice. Ignore the manual or die. And in that choice, he discovered something that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. 3 days after his fateful mission over Rabaul, Parker faced his next test, a bomber escort mission over Bougainville, a strategically vital island in the Solomon Islands. Before takeoff, Lieutenant Morrison pulled him aside, his face serious but determined. "If we see zeros today, use whatever you did over Rabaul," he said. "Don't care if it's not in the manual. Don't care if it goes against every rule in the book. Just do it. We need you to do it." Parker climbed into the rear gunner's compartment with a knot in his stomach. The first mission had felt like a fluke, a one-time stroke of luck that had somehow worked. Now he was being asked to replicate that success on purpose, to aim at empty sky and trust that Japanese fighters would fly straight into his bullets. His rational mind screamed that it was insane, that he was throwing away his chance at survival. But the part of him that had watched 3 zeros spiral into the ocean whispered that insane was the only way to win. He took a deep breath, adjusting his helmet and checking his guns one last time. He was ready. They reached the target area at 0900 hours, the sun shining bright overhead, as the B-24 Liberators in their formation began their bombing run on Japanese supply dumps. The sky was filled with anti-aircraft fire, black puffs of smoke that exploded around them, sending shrapnel clanging off the Corsair's fuselage. Parker kept his eyes scanning the horizon, his finger hovering over the trigger, waiting for the inevitable attack. Then Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. 4 zeros, 2 o'clock high, coming down fast. Steep dive, they're going for the bombers." Parker rotated his gun turret, his eyes locking onto the 4 zeros diving from 15,000 feet. They were moving at breakneck speed, their wings tilted at a 45-degree angle, giving him just 5 seconds to react. His training urged him to wait, to get a better sight picture, to calculate the deflection carefully. But he knew there was no time. He estimated the lead zero's dive speed and angle, calculating in his head where it would be in 1.2 seconds, the time it would take for his bullets to reach the target. Then he aimed 12 aircraft lengths ahead of it, a point in the sky that seemed impossibly far from the diving fighter. He squeezed the triggers, the twin .50 caliber roaring to life. The recoil jolted his shoulders backward, and hot brass casings showered down around him. Tracers streaked out ahead of the Corsair, a bright red stream that vanished into the empty sky. For a split second, Parker's heart sank. He thought he'd missed. But then the lead zero flew straight into the bullet stream. There was a loud explosion as its canopy shattered, and the pilot was thrown from the aircraft. The zero nosed over into a vertical dive, trailing black smoke all the way to the jungle below, where it crashed in a ball of fire. Parker didn't waste a second. He swung his guns to the second zero, which was turning mid-dive, trying to evade. He adjusted his aim, aiming even farther ahead to account for the turn, and fired again. The bullets tore through the zero's left wing, which separated from the fuselage with a loud snap. The aircraft tumbled out of control, spinning toward the ocean, its pilot unable to regain control. "You just got 2 in under 10 seconds, Morrison said, his voice filled with awe. "That's unheard of." Parker's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of success. His arms ached from the recoil, and the smell of cordite burned his throat. But he didn't care. He'd done it again, this time not by accident, but by design. The other 2 zeros, seeing their wingmen go down, broke off the attack, climbing back to altitude to regroup. Parker watched them go, his ammo counter showing he'd used roughly 200 rounds. He still had 1,300 left, plenty for whatever came next. The bombing run continued, the B-24s dropping their payloads on the Japanese supply dumps before turning for home. But the zeros weren't done. 6 more fighters attacked minutes later, using a coordinated assault from multiple angles. Classic Japanese tactics designed to overwhelm the American defenses. Parker engaged 3 of them in the span of 40 seconds, scoring 1 confirmed kill and damaging another so badly it fled trailing smoke. He missed the third, miscalculating the lead distance by a few feet. That miss was a crucial lesson. His method wasn't foolproof. It required precise estimates of target speed and trajectory. Get it wrong, and he missed by even more than the old method. But when he got it right, it was a game changer. hit probability jumping from 6% to nearly 60%. Morrison brought the Corsair back to the carrier at 11:30 hours, and Parker's gun position was credited with 5 Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged. The best single-mission gunnery performance in the squadron's history. The squadron commander was waiting on the flight deck, his face stern as he approached Parker. "What the hell are you doing differently?" he demanded. Parker explained his method, telling the commander about aiming at the target's future position instead of its current one. The commander frowned, shaking his head. "That contradicts everything in the manual," he said. "It's unauthorized. It's dangerous." Parker nodded, knowing the commander was right by Navy standards. But Morrison stepped forward, clapping Parker on the shoulder. "It works, sir," he said. "He's taking down Zeros, more than any other gunner in the squadron. We'd be losing more men if he wasn't doing it." The commander was silent for a moment, staring at Parker before sighing. "I'll pass this up the chain," he said. "Let the experts at Pensacola evaluate it. In the meantime, stick to the standard doctrine. No more experiments." He walked away, leaving Parker and Morrison alone. Morrison leaned in, his voice low. "Ignore him," he said. "Keep doing what you're doing. We need you alive." Parker's method worked for 3 simple reasons the Navy's manual had ignored: bullet flight time, human reaction time, and the aggressive flight patterns of Zero pilots. Standard deflection shooting assumed bullets arrived instantly, but they didn't. A .50 caliber round from a Corsair's rear gun had a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Fast, but not instantaneous. At typical engagement ranges of 300 to 500 yards, the bullet took 0.5 to 1 second to reach the target. In that time, a Zero traveling at 300 miles per hour covered 220 feet, 73 yards, nearly 3/4 of a football field. The manual's slight lead of 10 to 20 feet was laughably insufficient. By the time the bullets arrived, the Zero was long gone. Human reaction time compounded the problem. From the moment a gunner saw a Zero to the moment the first round left the barrel, 0.35 seconds passed. Time for the brain to process the threat, the muscles to move the fingers, and the guns to begin cycling. In that time, the Zero moved another 50 feet. Parker wasn't calculating these delays consciously. He was estimating them through 8 months of hard-won experience. His brain trained to predict the future instead of reacting to the present. Finally, Zero pilots were aggressive, holding maneuvers for seconds at a time, diving for 2 seconds, turning for a full rotation, making their future positions predictable. Parker's method exploited that predictability, turning the Zero's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The first person Parker taught was second-class aviation machinist mate Tommy Chen, a fellow rear gunner with 6 months of combat experience and 0 kills. Chen was frustrated, convinced he was a failure, and he begged Parker to tell him how he'd suddenly become a dead shot. The night after Parker's second mission, they sat in the carrier's ready room, and Parker explained his method. "Aim way ahead, at where the Zero will be, not where it is." Chen was skeptical, calling it impossible, until Parker took him to the flight deck after dark, using hand gestures to demonstrate the math of bullet flight and target speed. "It's like aiming at nothing," Chen said. "That's exactly what it is," Parker replied. "You aim at empty sky and trust the math." 2 days later, on November 13, Chen used the method during another Rabaul escort mission and scored his first confirmed kill, a Zero that flew straight into his bullet stream. When he landed, he ran to find Parker, a wide smile on his face. "It actually works," he said, repeating the words 3 times like a mantra. Word spread through the squadron faster than official orders, passed from gunner to gunner in ready rooms, on flight decks, and during late-night conversations in the carrier's mess hall. Parker became an unofficial instructor, drawing diagrams on scrap paper, demonstrating lead distances with his hands, and teaching men to trust their instincts instead of the manual. Some were skeptical. First-class aviation machinist mate Robert Hayes argued it contradicted everything he'd learned at Pensacola, but he tried it anyway, scoring 2 kills in his next engagement. By December 1943, 8 gunners in the squadron were using the extreme lead method, their combined kill rate jumping from 9 confirmed kills in October to 41 in December. The squadron commander called Parker in, questioning him about unauthorized training, but when he saw the numbers, he just said, "Keep doing it, but don't put anything in writing." The technique spread beyond Parker's squadron through informal channels. Carrier air groups rotating between ships, gunners swapping stories during Liberty calls in Sydney bars, and veterans teaching new recruits in the quiet moments between missions. It was called different things: extreme lead, future point shooting, the Parker method, but it was never given an official name, never mentioned in after-action reports. By March 1944, it had reached 15 squadrons across 4 carriers, kill rates doubling wherever it was adopted. Squadron commanders turned a blind eye, prioritizing results over doctrine, official disapproval, but unofficial acceptance. Japanese pilots noticed the change by April 1944, stunned that American rear gunners, who'd been easy to evade 6 months earlier, were now hitting with deadly accuracy. Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence analyzed the reports, concluding that Americans had developed advanced predictive gunsight technology. They couldn't fathom that the solution was as simple as aiming farther ahead. Their countermeasures backfired. Telling pilots to make more unpredictable maneuvers only made their future positions easier to estimate, as sharp turns locked them into flight paths for seconds at a time. By summer 1944, zero-loss rates to American rear gunners had skyrocketed 300% compared to late 1943. American bomber formations that had lost 10 to 15% of their aircraft to zero attacks now lost just 3 to 5%. Parker's method didn't receive official recognition until 1946, when a post-war Navy study analyzed Pacific combat reports and found that squadrons using extreme lead deflection had 3 times the kill rate of those following standard doctrine. The study credited unauthorized field modifications with a key role in American air superiority, and Pensacola quietly updated its training to teach larger lead angles, rebranding the technique as dynamic deflection shooting, never mentioning Parker by name. The method spread beyond Navy gunners, adopted by Army Air Force's tail gunners in B-17 and B-24s fighting German Bf-109 and FW-190s over Europe. It scaled into the jet age with Korean war gunners aiming 15 to 20 aircraft lengths ahead of MiG-15s, and even to Vietnam, where door gunners used it to engage trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Today, modern air combat uses radar-guided missiles and computer-controlled guns. But those computers run on the same principle Parker discovered over Rabaul. Calculate where the target will be, not where it is, and aim there. Richard Parker survived the war, flying 43 combat missions, scoring 17 confirmed kills and 9 probables, earning a promotion to Chief Aviation Machinist Mate and the Distinguished Flying Cross. His citation praised exceptional gunnery accuracy, but never mentioned the method he invented. After the war, he returned to Sacramento, California, working as an aviation mechanic for Pacific Airlines for 32 years, marrying and raising 2 daughters. He rarely spoke of the war, only with fellow veterans who understood the weight of what he'd done. Parker died in 1991 at the age of 70. His obituary mentioned his Navy service, but not the thousands of American air crews who'd survived, because a 24-year-old rear gunner had ignored the manual and aimed at empty sky over Rabaul Harbor. His legacy endures, not in military manuals or official citations, but in a simple revolutionary principle that changed the course of aerial combat. To hit a moving target, you don't aim at where it is, you aim at where it's going to be. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.